So our next speaker is Nicole Jones from the University of Western Australia, and her talk is about diapycnal mixing in the coastal ocean. So Nicole, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, so sorry that I can't be there in person for this meeting. It sounds like you're all having a great time there, so I'm sorry to not be there. So today I'm going to talk to you about, I guess, the focus of my research in recent years, which is really looking at diapycnal mixing in the coastal ocean. And this, of course, is not just my own work, but the work of a team of people. And largely, I'm going to be talking to you about some of the work from a recent PhD graduate of mine, Chris Whitwell. Sorry, just trying to change the slide. There we go. So, as we all know, the requirement to kind of plan and adapt to future coastal ocean conditions is going to require accurate predictions in the coastal ocean, of many scales, including heat, pollutants, and nutrients and sediment and the like. But in the coastal ocean, the dynamics are very complicated and often, very far from any type of equilibrium. And so, we get away with using RANS type ocean models with relatively kind of coarse resolution, but actually they don't have a lot of the important forcing in them that is actually producing the majority of the ocean mixing. So here on your right here, you can see this is a non-hydrostatic, very high resolution simulation nested within a larger scale hydrostatic model of a region on the northwest shelf, where you can see eddies and nonlinear internal waves that are happening at a very, very small scales, right? So we're not going to pick this up in your typical 1 kilometre scale, and nor are you going to be able to then put in any of the forcing that is actually driving the turbulence in those cases. So I'm not going to try to get to the point of answering any of those questions really in this presentation, but I'm more going to show some results of our observations that are trying to characterise what's causing the mixing and trying to kind of build up some sense of the relationship so that we can move on to better parameterization for the coastal ocean. So as I said, I'm largely going to be talking about observations. So my group puts observations in largely on the Australian Northwest Shelf, which has become our kind of laboratory of sorts. And, this is a very wide shelf, but across its length, the conditions are quite varied. So this is just showing you some of the different bathymetric features as you go from the north to the south. And we put in these various instrument packages that include microstructure turbulence measurements, but also we use fine scale measurements so that we have, a few months at a time of observations that really kind of get to the heart of the processes that are driving the turbulence. So what I'm going to present to you today is first kind of talk quite a bit about the connection between the nonlinear internal waves and ocean mixing on the shelf. And then I'm going to take some much longer term observations that are years long and try and characterise some of the variability that we see there, and finish up with some concluding thoughts. So the first set of observations that we are going to focus on is some observations that are taken in this Rolly Shoals area. So these are some offshore reefs, the Rolly Shoals, known as the Rolly Shoals, and we've got some observations extending across the shelf from a depth of about 300 metres of water into about 150 metres of water. And we did take some microstructure turbulence measurements here on the moorings, but they're limited to, a very few number of heights. But to extend out our time series, we've developed a method that relies on the Ellison length scale, which we can estimate from reasonably fast temperature time series, as well as knowledge of the shear. I'm going to tend to focus on presenting the turbulent heat flux as opposed to the diffusivity. And the reason for doing this is that the temperature gradients tend to change quite a bit. And sometimes we have very large diffusivity at times when the temperature gradient is very small. And so it's not really doing that much in terms of the turbulent heat flux. So in these shelf environments, the turbulent heat flux is perhaps a fairer measurement to look at when you're looking at contrasting dynamics. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a summary of all of the observations from, well, not all of the observations, but all of the observations over a 2-month experiment at the mid-depth of each of those 3 moorings. And so this is just showing you the contribution to the turbulent heat flux as a cumulative histogram. And I guess the takeaway from this is that we have these very skewed distributions of the turbulent heat flux. And the reality is that it's these very intermittent events that are contributing to a very large amount of the turbulent heat flux. So it's these events like the nonlinear internal waves that are actually doing the majority of the heat flux. And so it's really important that we're actually, getting these fine scale processes in so that we can accurately determine the mixing. So what we could do with this data set, which as I said is about 2 months long, is we can go through and classify different types of nonlinear internal wave events. And so Chris figured out a scheme to kind of be able to differentiate between these different types of events. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to show you some examples of what they look like. So here we have a mode 1 wave of depression example. The colour here is showing you the turbulent heat flux, with the yellower colours being the larger values. And we're looking at 2 different moorings. So this one's the 200 metre depth, and this is the 150 metre depth. And they're just very short parts of the record, zoomed right in, just to show you what particular events look like. And so this is tracking the same 2 waves of depression as they travel inshore and are picked up at the shallower mooring. What we can see here in these line plots is some of the long-term statistics over the entire data set of this mooring. So the dark grey line shows us the mean value of the turbulent heat flux, and the grey dash line is the median. And we can compare that to the blue line, which is just what was measured or averaged over the duration of this event. So you can see that these values of the event are exceeding the median value and sometimes getting up closer to that mean value, particularly in the surface in the shallow mooring. So moving on to another type of event, these are breaking mode 2 internal waves. So now we're out at the deeper site, and we can see these mode 2 waves have quite large amounts of heat flux associated with them. We're getting right up to that mean value, both at the shallow site, at the deep site and the shallow site. And we see that in the shallow site, that kind of coherent train of mode 2 waves has disappeared. So some of that energy has been transferred into higher frequencies. We also did see this occurrence quite often of these very high frequency overturns, which were close to the buoyancy frequency in terms of their oscillation. And these actually were contributing. So this is the red line is showing what these values were over this event. These were contributing greatly to the turbulent heat flux. So pushing right out to the upper limit of the internal waves. And I think this is our final example. I can't quite see. So yes, this is our second last example. In fact, this is an internal bore. So we see this push up of the very cold water close to the seabed that results in much higher values of the turbulent heat flux close to the seabed here. And we have done another experiment previously that's really focused on these bore events. And we can see that we could see from this data some of the intricate dynamics of what happens with different types of breaking with these bores. But we also found that there was a strong relationship between the magnitude of the turbulent heat flux associated with a particular wave and that wave steepness. So very strongly related to the types of near breaking instabilities that were observed. And the final example that we had in this experiment was hydraulic jumps. And so in the case of the hydraulic jump, these were some of the largest increases in the turbulent heat flux that we recorded. And these events tended to occur mainly at our shallowest site, which was close to this small kind of ridge feature on the shelf there. And so you can see this green line is far exceeding our mean record at this site. So these are, I've just shown you some examples and kind of over the event what the statistics look like. But we can now take all of the events over the entire 2-month record and summarise these. I can change the slide, there we go, at the different sites. So what you're looking at here is the turbulent heat flux. Just don't worry about the dashed line, we're just worried about the solid lines. There's enough information on here to digest. For each of the different moorings, so the 3 moorings as you go across the shelf. The black line, first of all, I'll draw your attention to, because this black line tells us what the mean heat flux was for all of the nonlinear internal wave events that were recorded at that particular site. So you can see that there's a really big difference between the offshore site and the innershore sites, where that number, that contribution to the heat flux has increased a lot at the shallower site. So what this is telling us is that at the deeper site, there are other processes obviously going on that were more important than the nonlinear internal waves in terms of generating the turbulent heat fluxes. At the shallower sites, where the nonlinear internal waves were very important, we can start to look at the contributions from the different types of waves. So we can see in this site at 200 metres that those very high frequency oscillations close to the buoyancy frequency are contributing quite a bit, around 20%. And then the next most important, and particularly the most important close to the seabed, were those bore events. So this gives us a good taste of what the main contributors are to the mixing at this site, and I guess, you know, really reinforces this idea that these very intermittent events are generating a lot of the turbulent heat flux. But we also have these records which are collected by, or funded by the Australian government, that are collected across the same shelf. And now we have 3.5-year long records at each of these sites, which are all in 200 metres of water along the shelf break. And so we can look at much longer term changes, including seasonal variability with these observations. So here, just a quick summary of the 3.5 years of data that we've analysed. I'm showing you the median in blue and the mean in purple as a function of depth for each of these 4 sites. So the Barrow Island site is this one to the south. Going up to the bottom of the page is this Lindock site, which is the furthest to the north. So you can see that there's some differences in magnitude, but you can also see that there's differences in the variability with depth. So what was done with these observations is we looked at some of the changes with some of the longer term processes like seasonal changes. So what we see in this region, which is closer to the tropics, is we can reasonably well characterise or differentiate between a kind of summer and winter, or wet and a dry conditions, from strongly near surface stratification to well mixed surface layer during the winter. And we can then pull apart our observations into these two categories. So the solid dots are those that you can focus on here, the pink being the summer conditions and the blue being the winter conditions. And these are for the Barrow Island site furthest to the south. So you can see there's a distinct difference between the two. The open dots are showing you what happens in any one year. So you can see there's also quite a bit of variability from year to year. If we look across all the sites, we don't see as strong a seasonal difference at some of our sites compared to the one furthest to the north and the south. We also broke down the data into spring and neap conditions, and so these were just based on the surface tide. So we know we have the interaction of the surface tide and the internal tide in this location, but we just did the simple thing and looked at the surface tide. The nonlinear internal waves are quite strongly related to the phasing of the surface tide because of the connected dynamics here. And you can see here that there's some sites where there's not really much difference between spring and neap, and there's other sites where you get a very distinct variation. And that's a result of the different contributors to the surface tide at these different locations. We also looked at flood and ebb variation, and so again, because of the relationship of the surface and the internal tide, we do see a strong relationship here at some of the sites. Particularly draw your attention to the Rolly Shoals site, where there is a big difference between the flood and the ebb, and also where in the Linendock site, where we see a similar reasonably large difference between the two incoming and outgoing surface tide phases. But, you know, looking at all that information separately, it's hard to put it all together. So this figure now kind of takes all of that information just for one site, just to whet your appetite, just for the Rolly Shoals site. And what we see here, I'll go through it quite slowly, so there's a lot on this. We've broken the data first into the flood and the ebb phase of the tide. So everything here that's on the right-hand side is the contribution to the turbulent heat flux during the flood tide. So straight away at this Rolly Shoals side, we can see that there's a much larger contribution during the flood tide. This is probably likely due to the fact that the nonlinear internal waves are mainly occurring in the flood phase of the tide at this site. We can also start to see that there's a difference between winter and summer within that flood tide phase. So we can see that in the winter time, we've got a much stronger contribution to the heat flux than we do in the summer period. And this is across the three different depths. So this is surface, middle and bottom approximately. And we also have differentiated between the spring and the neap phases, which is a smaller difference between these sites, but nonetheless a difference. So this is, I guess, a useful way of unpicking the data, but it also makes you think, well, when we take these much shorter records of turbulence, and they may just be a few microstructure profiles at some sites, what are we really measuring, and how do we relate it to this, you know, much larger amount of variability that we have in reality? So we use this data set to test that question. So what we did is we broke the data set into 6-hour chunks, and so this is showing you what's happening across those 6-hour chunks. The red dots here are showing you the complete data set mean, whereas the grey line is showing you what happens if you just have measurements of 6 hours. So the seasonal variation is kind of taken out of this, or at least represented in these percentile bands, because we've taken all of the 6-hour chunks and averaged them all together in the end to get this grey line. But you can see that by not sampling over the tidal variability at the very least, then you are a long way off between your total 3.5-year measurement average and your average that you might have from a 6-hour data set. And we tested, yes.
1 more minute.
Cool. I think I'm pretty much on track.
Okay. Thank you.
And we could also we also tested this over all of the sites and for 7 days and 28 days. So you can see that once you're getting up to 28 days, that your grey line and your red dots are starting to come together. So, you know, this is a reasonable amount of time to sample in the coastal ocean to get a good estimate of the turbulence. So, conclusions, I might just leave my summary there, but the more important thing, my conclusions down the bottom. So I think that what we're showing here really highlights the importance of including the impact of those smaller scale processes such as the nonlinear internal waves, the submesoscale eddies, in order to get the turbulence right and to understand what's happening in our regional oceans. It kind of questions whether Iran's ocean model at the types of resolutions that we're using at least will ever be suitable. And certainly hydrostatic models quite questionable in terms of reproducing some of these, well, that they're not able to reproduce any of these types of dynamics. And all these observations also help to guide us as to how to suitably sample turbulence in the coastal ocean. So I will leave you with thanks to the team that made this all possible, and a list of some papers and acknowledgements to finish off with. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Maybe we have time for some quick questions.
Hi, Nicole, thanks. So when you were referring to nonlinear internal waves, do you mean soliton-like nonlinear structures, or are these linear waves that are undergoing strong nonlinear interactions?
These are waves that have evolved largely from the internal tide that propagates across from Indonesia, across the Indian Ocean basin, and evolves into these nonlinear packets of waves. Some of them are close to soliton-like, but many of them are, you know, outside of meeting that solitary wave definition.
Again.
Sorry, Nicole, I have a question too. I wanted to ask about the contributions of spring and the neap variations that you showed. So for the long-term variability, do you have an idea of how long the time scale should be, or what is the minimum or kind of time scales for which these variations become important or begin to become important?
Do you mean in terms of observing the ocean or reproducing in a model the ocean?
I mean in terms of energy contributions, so changes in energy. Are there time scales for which they are important, and maybe for some which it doesn't matter, maybe because they're averaged out in a way?
I guess it depends. It perhaps depends on the timescale of the process that you're interested in studying. So if it was something like the transport of heat, then I think the timescales of those, that variability in the processes is going to be significant, whereas some of the other longer term processes, maybe it all kind of averages out enough. But yeah, I think it's a difficult question to answer, and I guess it's kind of a simplified view to kind of say it's a spring neap variation, because that's kind of just a way of classifying the data under some larger scale process. But the reality is a lot of it's internal tide driven dynamics, and so it's maybe a little bit of a simplification. But I guess it's just a more acknowledgement that we do have these larger scale changes, and if we're only focused on very small amount of variability, that we may be missing some of this important change.
Okay, thank you.
Once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole.